The old music room always smelled like lemons and old wood. It was a quiet place, filled with the soft glow of afternoon light that streamed through the tall, arched windows, making dust motes dance in the air like tiny, silent spirits. In the center of it all sat the grand piano, a black beast of polished wood and gleaming white keys, waiting. And for the young man named Leo, it was more than an instrument. It was a voice. He wasn't the best student in the classical theory class, and he knew it. His understanding of complex chord structures and formal counterpoint was shaky at best. But when his fingers touched the keys, something else happened. It was a language he'd spoken since he was a little boy. A language his grandmother had taught him not from sheet music, but from feeling. She'd tell him, "Don't just play the notes, honey. Play the story behind them. Play the color blue. Play the feeling of a rainy Tuesday." And so he did. Today he was playing a Chopin nocturne. The other students sat in their stiff wooden chairs, notebooks open, trying to dissect the piece as if it were a frog in biology lab. But Leo wasn't dissecting it. He was living it. His eyes were closed, his body swaying gently with the ebb and flow of the melody. His fingers, which weren't always as disciplined as his teacher would like, moved with a fluid grace. He played the main melody beautifully, but then he'd add a little something extra, subtle bluesy note here, a soft, syncopated rhythm there that wasn't written on the page. It was his signature, his way of crawling inside the music and making it his own. For some of the students watching, it was mesmerizing. They could feel the longing in the melody, the quiet heartache. It was more than a performance. It was a conversation, but for one person in the room, it was a conversation going horribly wrong. Mr. Alistair Finch, the theory teacher, sat with his back ramrod straight, his hands clasped on his lap. His face was a mask of tight-lipped disapproval. To him, music was a cathedral, built with precise, sacred rules over centuries. Every note had its place, every dynamic its purpose. What Leo was doing, in his eyes, was like graffiti on the Sistine Chapel. It was vandalism. He watched Leo's fingers dance and saw only carelessness. He heard the emotional embellishments and heard only a lack of discipline. The slight bluesy twist wasn't art. It was a mistake. A beautiful, tempting mistake, but a mistake nonetheless. As the last note of the nocturne faded into a soft, echoing silence, a few of the students dared to glance at Mr. Finch, their expressions a mixture of admiration for Leo and fear of the teacher's reaction. Leo opened his eyes, a small, hopeful smile on his face. He had felt it that time. He had really connected with the piece. He looked at his teacher, expecting maybe, just maybe, a nod of acknowledgement. Instead, Mr. Finch slowly rose from his chair. The sound of his expensive shoes on the wooden floor was the only sound in the room. He walked to the front of the class, his posture as rigid as a conductor's baton. He didn't look at Leo, but at the other students, as if Leo was merely an object lesson. "Form," Finch began, his voice clipped and cold. "Form is the container that holds the emotion. Without the container, you have nothing but a spill, a mess." He finally turned his gaze to Leo, and his eyes were like chips of ice. What we just heard was not a performance. It was an emotional spill. Leo felt his face begin to grow hot. The hopeful smile vanished, replaced by a nod of confusion and shame. He opened his mouth to say something, but no words came out. "You have a gift, young man," Finch continued, his voice dripping with a condescending tone that was far worse than outright anger. "A raw, unrefined gift, but you treat it like a toy. You play with it, you smear your own feelings all over it, and you call it art. That is not art, that is self-indulgence." The other students stared down at their notebooks, at their shoes, at anything but the scene unfolding at the front of the room. The air was thick with tension, so heavy it was hard to breathe. "So, we are going to conduct an experiment," Finch said, a slight, cruel smile touching the corner of his lips. "We are going to take that raw, messy emotion of yours and we are going to put it in a box. A very strong, very difficult box." He walked over to a stack of sheet music on a side table and picked up a thick, formidable-looking booklet. He held it up for Leo to see. The title on the cover was in stark black letters, *Rachmaninoff, Prelude in C# minor. A plea, no, two dot asterisk Leo's heart sank. He knew that piece. Every pianist did. It was a monster. A tempest of thundering chords and furious, cascading notes that required incredible power and flawless technique. It was the complete opposite of the gentle, flowing nocturne he had just played. It was a piece built on pure, unadulterated technical skill. "The winter recital is in 6 weeks," Finch announced, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. This wasn't a private lesson anymore. It was a public sentencing. "You will learn this piece. You will practice it until your fingers bleed. And you will perform it, note for note, dynamic for dynamic. There will be no feeling, there will be no blue notes, there will only be what is written on this page. You will become a machine. You will prove to me and to yourself that you have the discipline to honor the music as it was intended." He took a step closer to Leo, lowering his voice to a menacing whisper that somehow still carried across the silent room. "If you fail, if you miss one note, or if you dare to add one of your own little flourishes, you will drop this class. You will stop wasting my time, and you will stop wasting the time of everyone here who is serious about this craft." He held the Rachmaninoff sheet music out. Leo's hand trembled as he reached for it. The paper felt heavy, like a lead weight. The humiliation was a physical force pressing down on his shoulders, making it hard to stand. He could feel the eyes of his classmates on him, a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. "Do you accept my challenge?" Mr. Finch asked, his voice returning to its normal, teacher-like volume. Leo's throat was dry. He wanted to argue, to shout that music was more than just notes on a page. He wanted to tell him that his grandmother had taught him the truth. But looking into the teacher's cold, unyielding eyes, he knew there was no point. This wasn't a discussion. It was a test. And he had no choice but to take it. He gave a single, stiff nod, unable to trust his own voice. "Good," Finch said, a look of grim satisfaction on his face. "The gauntlet has been thrown." He turned his back on Leo and addressed the class. "Let's move on to the analysis of the fugue state in Bach's C-sharp major fugue." Leo stood there for a moment, the heavy sheet music in his hand, his face burning with shame. He walked back to his seat on unsteady legs, the whispers of the Rachmaninoff prelude feeling like a curse. The challenge wasn't just to learn a difficult piece. It was to kill a part of himself, the part his grandmother had loved. And as he sat down, he wasn't sure he was strong enough to do it, or if he even wanted to be. The heavy sheet music felt like a brick in his backpack all the way home. Every step on the cracked pavement seemed to echo with Mr. Finch's words, a cruel rhythm in his head. Asterisk, an emotional spill, a mess, self-indulgence. He walked with his head down, watching his scuffed sneakers move one in front of the other. The world around him a blur of muted colors and distant sounds. The vibrant autumn afternoon, with its golden light and crisp air, felt like it was happening to someone else. For him, the sky was gray. Once inside his small apartment, he tossed the backpack onto a chair and the music slid out, landing face up on the worn wooden floor. The black notes stared up at him, a dense, intimidating forest of ink. He left it there and went to the kitchen, pouring himself a glass of water, his hands trembling slightly. He looked out the window at the brick wall of the next building, feeling completely and utterly alone. His piano, his beloved piano, sat in the corner of the living room, but for the first time, it looked like an opponent. It was no longer a friend, a confidant, a voice for his soul. It was the tool of his punishment. After a long while, he sighed, picked up the music, and sat on the bench. The familiar coolness of the ivory keys usually calmed him, but today it felt cold and unforgiving. He placed the Rachmaninoff on the stand. He took a deep breath and tried to start. The first few chords are famously powerful, a declaration of intent. He pressed his fingers down, but the sound that came out was not a thunderous roar. It was a muddled, clumsy thud. His fingers, which knew how to dance and flow, felt like stiff, awkward sausages. He tried again, this time focusing on each finger individually. The sound was a little cleaner, but it had no life, no soul. It was exactly what Finch wanted, a machine. He pressed on, gritting his teeth. His eyes darted between the sheet music and his hands, a frantic, panicked dance. The notes came faster, a cascade of black and white that his brain could barely process. A wrong note screeched out, harsh and jarring. He stopped, his heart pounding in his chest. He tried the passage again. Another mistake. Then another. A wave of hot frustration washed over him. This wasn't music. It was a test of agility, a finger-twisting puzzle with no heart. He slammed his hands down on the keys, creating a loud, discordant crash that made him flinch. Then, with a sob of anger, he slammed the piano lid shut. The final bang echoing the finality of his failure. For the next week, this became his routine. He would go to his classes, avoiding eye contact with everyone, especially Mr. Finch. He felt like a fraud. In his other classes, he couldn't focus. He'd stare at the professor, but all he could hear was the sound of his own fumbling attempts at the prelude. The humiliation was a constant companion, a heavy cloak he couldn't shrug off. He heard whispers in the hallway and was convinced they were about him. He saw classmates talking and laughing and knew, just knew, they were laughing at the boy who had been publicly put in his place. His practice sessions grew shorter and more desperate. He would sit at the piano for maybe 20 minutes, his shoulders hunched in defeat before giving up. The joy was gone. The magic was gone. Every time he looked at the piano, he saw Finch's cold, judgmental stare. He started to hate the piece. He started to hate the man who had forced it on him. And worst of all, he started to hate himself for not being strong enough, for not being the machine Finch wanted him to be. One night, around 10 o'clock, he was sitting on his couch in the dark, just staring at the silent piano. The Rachmaninoff was still on the stand, a monument to his failure. He was done. He had decided. Tomorrow he would go to the administration office and fill out the form to drop the class. He would let Finch win. It was better than this slow, torturous death of his spirit. He felt a strange sense of relief at the decision. The weight would be lifted. He walked over to the piano one last time, not to play the Rachmaninoff, but just to say goodbye. He lifted the lid and his fingers found the keys, not to play a song, but to just feel them one last time. He played a simple, sad melody, something he made up on the spot, a farewell tune. It was quiet and full of a gentle, aching sorrow. It was the most honest thing he had played in weeks. He was so lost in the melody that he didn't hear the soft knock at his door. It came again, a little louder this time. He wiped a tear from his cheek and went to open it. Standing there was his elderly neighbor from the apartment next door, a woman with kind eyes and silver hair pulled back in a loose bun. She was holding a small, steaming mug. "I heard you playing," she said softly, her voice warm and gentle. It sounded like a heart was breaking. He just stood there, not knowing what to say. He hadn't really spoken to her much, just a nod in the hallway now and then. She seemed to understand his silence. "May I?" she asked, gesturing towards the piano. He nodded and stepped aside. She sat on the bench, her arthritic fingers resting lightly on the keys. She didn't try to play anything complicated. She just played a few simple, bluesy chords, the kind of music that felt like a warm blanket on a cold night. "I used to play," she said, her eyes distant, "in smoky bars a long, long time ago. My teacher, he was a lot like yours, I think. Strict, told me my jazz was trash music." Leo looked at her, surprised. "He gave me a piece too," she continued, a small smile on her face. "Some classical thing. Told me I had to play it perfectly or I was out. I practiced until my fingers felt like they were going to fall off. I hated it. I hated him. I hated the piano." She stopped playing and turned to look at him, her gaze direct and full of understanding. "Then, one day, my grandfather heard me practicing. He said something I never forgot." She paused, and Leo found himself leaning in, hanging on her every word. He said, "That man gave you a cage, honey. Don't just learn to sit in it. Learn to rattle the bars until the whole world hears your song." The words hung in the air between them. Rattle the bars, it was like a light switched on in a dark room. Leo looked at the Rachmaninoff on the stand. For the first time, he didn't see it as a wall. He saw it as a cage. A very strong, very difficult cage with rigid, unyielding bars. But his neighbor was right. He didn't have to just sit inside it. He could rattle the bars. His neighbor patted his hand gently. "That man wants to take your voice away," she said softly. "Don't let him. Use his rules. Learn them better than he knows them. But when you play, you sing your own song. You let that song shake the whole damn cage." She got up and handed him the mug. "It's just chamomile tea," she said with a wink. "Good for shaky hands." Then she let herself out, leaving him alone with the piano, the tea, and a brand new idea. He sat back down on the bench, the warmth of the mug seeping into his hands. He looked at the music again. The notes were still the same. The difficulty was still the same. The challenge was still the same. But everything else had changed. It wasn't about becoming a machine anymore. It was about becoming a master of the machine. It was about learning the structure so well, so perfectly, that he could find the spaces where his own soul could breathe. He would learn every bar, every dynamic, every nuance. He would be so technically perfect that Finch would have nothing to criticize. And then, in the heart of that perfection, he would hide his own story, his own defiance. He would rattle the bars. A slow smile spread across his face, the first real smile in over a week. He took a sip of tea, placed the mug on the floor, and opened the lid to the piano. He was ready to begin. The words of his neighbor echoed in his mind long after she had gone, a gentle but powerful mantra in the quiet of his apartment. Asterisk rattle the bars. He looked at the Rachmaninoff prelude on the stand, no longer seeing it as a lifeless set of instructions. It was a structure, a fortress, and his job was to become its master, not its prisoner. He took a deep breath, the scent of old wood and lemon polish filling his lungs, and placed his fingers on the keys. This time there was no anger, no frustration. There was only a quiet, burning purpose. His practice changed completely. Before, he had been trying to bulldoze his way through the piece, fueled by a desperate need to just get it right. Now he became a detective. He started to take the prelude apart, note by note, chord by chord. He'd play a single measure, then stop, closing his eyes, listening to the sound fade into the silence. What was Rachmaninoff trying to say here? Why this chord and not that one? He wasn't just learning the music. He was trying to understand its soul. He spent hours on just the first few pages, playing them so slowly it was almost unrecognizable, feeling the weight of each key. The transition between each note, his life began to revolve around the piano. He would go to his classes during the day, his mind a half step behind, his thoughts always drifting back to a tricky passage or a complex chord progression. He'd eat his meals quickly, his notebook open on the table, scribbling down fingerings or drawing little diagrams of the keyboard. As soon as his classes were over, he would head straight to the music department, claiming the same practice room every day. Soon, his late-night sessions became the stuff of legend among the other music students. The building would fall silent, the hallways growing dark and empty, but from behind the closed door of room 204, the sound of a piano would spill out. It wasn't always perfect. Sometimes they would hear the same phrase played over and over, a little faster each time. Sometimes they would hear a sudden, furious crash of chords, followed by a moment of silence, and then the quiet, determined start of the phrase again. He was a ghost in the machine, a lone soldier fighting a battle no one else could see. The physical toll was immense. His fingers, which were once slender and quick, began to feel like solid, calloused tools. He'd wake up in the middle of the night with his hands cramping, his muscles aching with a deep, persistent soreness. He developed a small, permanent indentation on his right thumb, where he pressed it against the wood of the piano for leverage during the thunderous chords. There were days when he felt so exhausted he could barely lift his arms, his body screaming for rest. But he would push through, fueled by the memory of Finch's cold, dismissive voice and the image of his classmates' pitying stares. About 3 weeks into his new routine, he hit a wall. There was a section in the middle of the piece, a rapid cascade of notes that flew down the keyboard like a waterfall of glass. No matter how many times he practiced it, his fingers would trip, fumbling, creating a sloppy, jarring mess. He could play it perfectly slowly, but the moment he tried to bring it up to speed, it all fell apart. One night, after 2 hours of failing on the same 8 measures, he felt the old frustration bubbling up inside him. He slammed his fists on the keys, the same discordant crash from weeks ago echoing in the small room. He leaned his forehead against the cool wood of the piano, his body trembling with exhaustion and anger. He couldn't do it. Finch was right. He was a mess. He was about to give up, to pack his bag and go home when his neighbor's words came back to him again. Asterisk rattled the bars. He lifted his head. He wasn't just trying to play the notes. He was fighting them. He was trying to force his fingers to do something they didn't want to do. He closed his eyes and thought about the feeling of that section. It wasn't just fast. It was desperate. It was a cry of anguish, a moment of pure, unadulterated panic. He had been playing it with technical frustration. What if he played it with emotional panic? He took a deep breath and placed his hands back on the keys. He didn't think about the notes. He didn't think about his fingers. He thought about the day Finch had humiliated him. He thought about the heat in his face, the silence in the room, the feeling of the heavy sheet music in his hand. He let all that anger and shame and helplessness build up inside him, a tight knot in his chest. And then he unleashed it all into the keys. The cascade of notes that came out was not just fast. It was ferocious. It was a torrent of raw emotion, a sonic representation of his own despair. And for the first time, it was perfect. Every note was clear, every rhythm precise. The technique was there, but it was being driven by something much more powerful. It was being driven by his soul. He had done it. He had found a way to pour his own story into the rigid structure of the piece. He was rattling the bars, and the sound was incredible. From that moment on, his practice transformed once again. He was no longer just a detective. He was a blacksmith. The piano was his forge, the prelude his raw material, and his emotions were the fire. He would take a passage and infuse it with a specific feeling. The thunderous opening chords became his defiance, his anger at being belittled. The haunting, melancholic middle section became his vulnerability, his fear of failure. The frantic, cascading runs became his desperation, his fight to be heard. He was forging the Rachmaninoff prelude into a weapon, a shield and a voice, all at the same time. As the day of the recital drew closer, a change came over him. The nervous energy that had once made him shaky was now channeled into a quiet, unshakable confidence. He walked through the hallways of the music department with his head held high. He no longer avoided eye contact with his classmates. Instead, he would offer a small, knowing smile. He had done the work. He had put in the hours. He had faced the monster and not only tamed it, but made it his own. He was no longer just a student who played by feel. He was a musician who understood that true feeling wasn't about breaking the rules, but about mastering them so completely that you could make them sing your own song. He was ready. He was more than ready. He was going to walk onto that stage and show Mr. Alistair Finch exactly what an emotional spill really sounded like. The night of the recital arrived with a crispness in the air that felt like a promise. The university auditorium, usually a place of dusty lectures and sleepy students, had been transformed. The lights were dimmed, casting a warm, golden glow on the heavy velvet curtains and the polished wood of the stage. The air buzzed with a quiet energy, a blend of perfume, rustling programs, and the low murmur of excited conversation. People filed in, finding their seats, their faces turned towards the grand piano that sat center stage, looking like a sleek black beast under the spotlight, backstage. In the small, cramped wings, the world was a different place. It was a world of shadows and muffled sounds, of nervous pacing and quiet, deep breaths. Leo sat on a straight-backed wooden chair, his hands resting loosely on his knees. He wasn't nervous in the way he used to be, not the shaky, sick-to-his-stomach feeling of dread. This was different. It was a tight, coiled energy, like a spring waiting to be released. He had done the work. He had put in the hours, the sweat, the heartache. The piece was no longer a monster to be feared. It was a part of him. He had bled into those keys, and now it was time to let the world see the scar. A stagehand peeked around the curtain. "You're on next," she whispered, giving him a small, encouraging smile. He nodded and stood up, smoothing down the front of his dark shirt. As he walked towards the edge of the stage, he could see the audience through a small gap in the curtain. It was a sea of faces, some familiar, some not. And then he saw him. Mr. Finch was sitting in the third row, exactly as he'd known he would be. He wasn't looking at the program or chatting with his neighbor. He was staring straight at the stage, his arms crossed over his chest, his expression one of cool, expectant judgment. He looked like a man waiting for a verdict. Leo felt a flicker of the old anger, but it wasn't a hot, messy flame anymore. It was a cold, hard diamond in his gut. He took one last, deep breath and stepped out into the light. The walk to the piano felt both infinitely long and over in a single second. The polite smattering of applause that greeted him was just background noise. His world had shrunk to the polished black wood of the instrument, the single bench, and the 88 keys waiting for him. He sat down, the bench creaking softly under his weight. He adjusted it, a small, familiar ritual that grounded him. He flexed his fingers, feeling the strength in them, the calluses that were now like armor. He looked out at the audience for a brief moment, his eyes finding Finch's one last time. Then he closed his eyes and the world disappeared. He placed his fingers on the keys, and for a single, silent heartbeat, there was nothing. Then he began. The opening chords of the Rachmaninoff prelude are famous. They are meant to be a declaration, a tolling bell that commands attention. What the audience heard that night was more than a declaration. It was a thunderclap. The sound that filled the auditorium was so powerful, so precise, it felt like the entire building had taken a sharp intake of breath. There was no muddiness, no hesitation. It was a sound of absolute, unshakable authority. In the third row, Mr. Finch's eyes widened almost imperceptibly. He had expected a struggle. He had expected to hear the boy fighting the notes. This was not a fight. This was a command. From that thunderous opening, the music cascaded into a torrent of furious, driving notes. Leo's fingers flew across the keyboard, a blur of motion that was almost too fast to follow. But it wasn't just speed. Every note was clear, every rhythm sharp and defined. He was playing with a fiery intensity that was breathtaking to watch. His body was no longer swaying gently. It was moving with the music, a coiled spring of energy, his shoulders and arms channeling the power that was pouring out of the piano. This was the part of the music he had forged with his anger and defiance. It was the sound of a person pushing back against a wall, not with desperation, but with overwhelming force. The audience, who had settled in for a competent student performance, was now leaning forward in their seats, completely captivated. They weren't just hearing a difficult piece being played well. They were feeling a story of epic struggle. Then, just as the intensity reached its peak, the music shifted. The storm broke, and a new atmosphere settled over the hall. The furious cascade of notes softened into a haunting, melancholic melody. It was a complete change of character. The raw power was replaced by a deep, aching vulnerability. This was the part he had infused with his fear, his moments of doubt, the quiet sadness of feeling alone and misunderstood. His touch on the keys became feather-light, the notes hanging in the air like fragile, crystalline tears. The melody was simple, but he played it with such a profound sense of longing that it felt like he was whispering a secret to every single person in the room. A young woman in the front row dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. An old man reached over and took his wife's hand. The music was no longer just sound. It was a shared human experience. It was the sound of a heart laid bare, but this moment of vulnerability was not an end in itself. It was the calm before the final storm. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the intensity began to build again. The quiet melody began to be punctuated by deeper, more ominous chords. The pace quickened. The tension in the room became almost unbearable. Leo was pulling the audience back into the struggle, but this time it was different. It wasn't just anger anymore. It was anger mixed with the pain they had just felt. It was a cry of defiance born from a place of deep hurt. His fingers were once again a blur, but now they carried the weight of the entire emotional journey. The thunderous opening theme returned, but this time it was even more powerful, more cataclysmic. It was the sound of a soul breaking free, not just rattling the bars of its cage, but shattering them completely. He drove towards the final, crashing chords, his whole body moving with the music, his face a mask of fierce concentration and raw emotion. And then he struck the final chords. They were not just loud, they were absolute. A final, definitive statement that echoed through the hall, a sonic boom that seemed to hang in the air forever. And then there was silence. It wasn't just the absence of sound. It was a presence. A heavy, profound silence that filled every corner of the auditorium. No one moved. No one breathed. It was as if the music had been so powerful that it had erased time itself. Leo sat at the piano, his chest heaving, his hands hovering over the keys. His fingers were trembling, not from fear, but from the sheer force of what he had just unleashed. He slowly lowered his hands to his lap and opened his eyes. The silence held for 5 full seconds. And then it was broken. It started with a single person clapping, then another and another, until it grew into a thunderous, deafening wave of sound. The audience leaped to its feet as one, their faces a mixture of awe, shock, and pure, unadulterated joy. People were cheering, whistling, and shouting, "Bravo!" The sound was overwhelming, a physical force that washed over the stage. Leo looked out at the sea of standing, cheering people, his mind struggling to process it all. He saw his fellow students, their mouths open in disbelief. He saw people he didn't know, their faces flushed with emotion, and then his eyes found Mr. Finch. The teacher was still in his seat, but he was no longer a figure of cool judgment. His mask of smug superiority was gone, shattered into a million pieces. His mouth was slightly agape, his arms had fallen to his sides, and his eyes were wide with a look of pure, unadulterated shock. There was no applause from him, only a silent, stunned acknowledgement. In that single frozen moment, Leo knew. He hadn't just won the challenge. He had done something far more important. He had proven that the most powerful music doesn't just come from the fingers or from the page. It comes from the soul. And he had just shown his soul to the world. The wall of sound that hit him was a physical thing, a warm, solid force that pushed him back on the bench. The lights of the auditorium, which had been focused points of white, now blurred into a single, golden haze. The faces in the crowd were a sea of indistinct shapes, all standing, all clapping, all one. For a moment he was disconnected, floating above it all, watching a young man at a piano bathed in light and adoration. Then the reality of it came crashing down. This was for him. The sound was for him. He slowly, shakily rose to his feet. The applause grew even louder, if that was possible. He gave a small, awkward bow, his body still humming with the residual energy of the music. He wasn't a performer who knew how to work a crowd. He was just a guy who had poured his heart out, and now the crowd was giving it back, amplified 1,000 times. He bowed again, then turned and walked off the stage, his legs feeling like they might give out at any moment. The moment he stepped into the wings, the world rushed back in. The air was cooler here, filled with the hushed energy of people waiting. The first person to reach him wasn't a teacher or an official. It was one of his classmates, a violinist who had always sat in the front row, diligently taking notes. She didn't say anything at first. She just grabbed his arm, her eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and awe. "That was—" She started, then shook her head, unable to find the word. "That wasn't music. That was— I don't know what that was." Before he could respond, he was swarmed. Students he barely knew were clapping him on the back, grinning, their faces alight with excitement. They weren't just being polite. They were genuinely moved, genuinely shaken. He saw the theory students, the ones who always sided with Finch, looking at him with a new kind of respect. He wasn't the emotional kid anymore. He was a force of nature. He was a story they would all be telling for years. He managed to slip away from the crowd, finding refuge in the same small, quiet practice room where he had spent so many lonely nights. He closed the door, and the muffled sound of the crowd faded to a distant roar. He sat on the same hard chair, leaning his head back against the cool wall. The adrenaline was starting to fade, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. But underneath the exhaustion was something else, a quiet, steady peace. He thought about the journey, about the humiliation in that classroom, the despair in his apartment, the long, painful hours of practice. He thought about his neighbor's words about rattling the bars. He had done it. He had taken the cage Finch had built for him and had made it sing with a voice Finch couldn't possibly understand. The victory wasn't in the standing ovation or the cheers. It was in this quiet moment, in the empty space inside his own chest where the shame and self-doubt used to live. That space was now filled with a calm, unshakable certainty. He knew who he was as a musician. He must have dozed off because he was startled awake by a soft knock on the door. He sat up, expecting to see another student wanting to talk. But when the door opened, it was Mr. Finch who stood there, silhouetted in the hallway light. The man looked smaller somehow. His rigid posture seemed to have softened. His shoulders were slumped just slightly. He didn't enter the room. He just stood in the doorway, holding the program for the recital in his hand. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The air was thick with everything that had passed between them. "The coda?" Finch said finally, his voice quieter than he had ever heard it. He wasn't looking at Leo, but at the program in his hands. The final chords, the rubato. It was unorthodox. Leo held his breath, waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the criticism he knew was coming. "But the precision," Finch continued, still not looking at him. "The dynamic control, even with the unorthodox interpretation. It was flawless." He finally looked up and his eyes met Leo's. There was no apology in them. Finch was not a man who apologized. But there was something else. A crack in the icy facade. A flicker of a question he had never thought to ask before. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Then he turned and walked away, leaving Leo alone with the quiet hum of the building dot in the weeks that followed. Everything changed. The performance became a legend, a story whispered in the hallways and practice rooms of the music department. "Did you hear him that night?" Students would ask. It was like the piano was alive. He was no longer an outsider, the kid who struggled with theory. He was the one who had faced the dragon and won. Other students started coming to him, not for help with their theory homework, but for advice on expression on how to find the story in the music. He found himself talking about his grandmother, about playing the color blue, about finding the emotion in the structure. He had learned the rules so well that he now had the authority to teach others how to bend them. He continued to practice. But it was different now. It was no longer a desperate battle. It was a conversation. He would play the Bach fugues that Finch loved, but he would play them with a new depth, a new understanding of their architectural beauty. And then he would play his own music, the simple, bluesy melodies that came from his heart. He realized that Finch had, in his own cruel way, given him a gift. By forcing him to build the cage, Finch had given him the strongest possible foundation. And by learning to rattle the bars, he had learned how to make the whole world listen. One afternoon, months later, he was sitting in the old music room. The sun was streaming through the windows, just like it had on the day of the challenge. He wasn't practicing anything specific. He was just playing, letting his fingers wander over the keys. He played a simple, gentle melody, the kind of tune his grandmother would have loved. It was full of space and feeling, technically simple but emotionally complex. As he played, he saw a group of new first-year students walk past the open door. They stopped, listening, their faces captivated. He smiled to himself, a genuine, easy smile. He hadn't just become a great pianist. He had become a storyteller. And he knew, with a certainty that filled him with a quiet joy, that this was only the beginning of his story. The legend wasn't just about that one performance. It was about the musician he had become and the music he would continue to make, from a place that was finally and forever his own.